When they took her water, they thought she'd die quietly. She didn't. A widow, 5,000 acres, and a man upstream who just cut off every drop of water keeping her cattle alive. Evelyn Mercer had already buried her husband, watched her crew walk out one by one, and held this ranch together with nothing but her own 2 hands and whatever pride she had left. She wasn't supposed to survive the year. That was the plan. His plan. But nobody told Evelyn that. If you've ever fought for something when everyone around you was betting on your failure, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The last man to quit was a 40-year-old hand named Rufus Doyle, and he had the decency to look ashamed about it. He stood in the yard with his hat in both hands, turning it slowly like he was wringing water out of something. His horse was already saddled and waiting near the fence post, packed light, the way men pack when they've already made up their minds and just need to get through the conversation. Evelyn Mercer stood on the porch and watched him. She didn't make it easier on him. She figured he didn't deserve easy. "Ma'am," Rufus started, "I got a brother over in Cheyenne who's got work, steady work, and You don't have to explain it, Rufus. No, I want to. I want you to understand it ain't personal." 4 men quit in 6 weeks, Evelyn said. At what number does it stop being personal? Rufus looked at the ground. A muscle worked in his jaw. "I got a family to feed. And the boys are saying, well, they're saying this ranch ain't long for—" "I know what they're saying." He nodded, kept nodding, like the movement would carry him to his horse faster. "I'm sorry about Thomas. I truly am. He was a good man." "He was," she said. There was nothing else after that. Rufus pulled himself into the saddle, touched the brim of his hat, and rode south without looking back. Evelyn stayed on the porch until the sound of hooves faded into the wind. Then she sat down on the top step and put her face in her hands. She didn't cry. She'd done enough of that. She just breathed. Thomas Mercer had died 8 months ago in a cattle stampede. Not some dramatic cinematic death, but a terrible, sudden, senseless one. The herd had broken in a thunderstorm, the darkness full of noise and movement, and Thomas had ridden into it because that was what you did. His horse went down somewhere in the chaos. By the time they found him, it was over. He had been 31 years old. He left behind a wife, nearly 5,000 acres of Wyoming ranch land, 400 head of cattle, a mountain of unpaid supply debts, and approximately 0 people who believed Evelyn could hold any of it together. She was 28. She had grown up on a small homestead 2 counties over, had helped her father work cattle since she was tall enough to reach a saddle horn. She knew land. She knew animals. She knew the particular language of hard seasons and harder choices. But none of that mattered to the men who watched from neighboring spreads with barely concealed anticipation, waiting for the Mercer Ranch to crack so they could pick through what was left. What people don't tell you about grief is how it becomes a kind of public performance. Everyone watches to see how you're holding up. And in a frontier territory where weakness was treated like a contagious disease, a widow holding 5,000 acres was a spectacle nobody could look away from. Evelyn stood up, brushed the dust off her skirt, and went back inside to figure out how she was going to brand 300 cattle with 2 men and a prayer. Cole Ashford arrived on a Tuesday, which Evelyn always remembered later because Tuesdays were the days the supply wagon came from town, and she had been standing in the yard arguing with the driver about a bill she couldn't fully pay when a rider appeared on the northern ridge. He came down slow. No hurry to him at all. That was the first thing she noticed. The man moved like he had nowhere pressing to be, which was an odd quality in someone who was clearly arriving somewhere on purpose. He was tall in the saddle, lean in the way men get when they spend most of their lives outdoors and don't think much about eating. The horse was a gray mare, well kept, better than you'd expect from the look of the man himself. His jacket was worn at both elbows. His boots had seen better years. He had a week's worth of dark stubble on a face that would have been handsome if it hadn't looked so thoroughly tired of things. He stopped a respectful distance away and addressed himself to Evelyn, not the wagon driver, which she noticed. "Heard you might be taking on riders," he said. "Word travels," Evelyn said. "It does." He didn't elaborate on where or from whom. "What's your name?" "Cole Ashford." "Where you coming from, Cole Ashford?" A pause, brief enough that she might have imagined it. "Montana. Most recent." "Most recent." Not recently. As if there was a long chain of places before Montana, and he was only offering her the most current link. You got references? I got skills, he said. References from men who'll vouch for me are a day's ride in either direction, if you want them. But I figured you might be short on time. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, the supply wagon driver was making pointed sounds about needing to get moving. She had 2 remaining ranch hands. Old Pete, who was 63 and moved like he was carrying someone else's bones, and a 19-year-old named Danny Rourke, who worked hard but panicked under pressure. She had a fall roundup coming in 3 weeks. She had cattle that needed branding, fencing that needed mending, and a north pasture that had developed a flooding problem nobody had identified the source of yet. You ride well? She asked. Well enough. Can you work cattle? Can. Can you take direction from a woman without making everyone's life miserable about it? He didn't flinch at the question, which she appreciated. A lot of men would have either over-explained their progressive sensibilities or gotten their backs up. Cole just looked at her steadily and said, I can take direction from whoever knows what they're doing. And if I don't always know what I'm doing, then I'd rather work for someone who admits it than someone who doesn't. He shifted in his saddle. You want me to come back tomorrow, give you time to think it? Can you start today? I can start now. She hired him. She'd tell people later that she hired him because she was desperate, which was true, and because he had an honest face, which was partly true. But the real reason, the one she didn't usually say out loud, was the way he'd looked at her when she asked about taking direction from a woman. He hadn't performed tolerance. He hadn't reassured her. He just answered the question like it was a reasonable question with a reasonable answer, which, in her experience, was rarer than gold in these parts. The Mercer Ranch had been in Thomas's family for 2 generations. His grandfather had broken the original ground, his father had expanded it, and Thomas had inherited a spread that was productive enough to be valuable and large enough to be genuinely difficult to manage. The land ran from a wide creek bottom in the east, up through rolling pasture to rocky high ground in the north. And the creek, Harlan Creek it had been called since before anyone living could remember, was the ranch's lifeblood. Everything depended on that water. The cattle needed it. The kitchen garden needed it. The small hay meadow that kept the herd alive through winter needed it. Without Harlan Creek, the Mercer Ranch was 5,000 acres of increasingly useless real estate. Evelyn knew this. What she didn't know yet was that someone else knew it too. Gideon Blackwell had been ranching in the valley for 15 years, and in that time he had grown his operation from a modest spread into something that could reasonably be called an empire. 8,000 acres, 300 employees at peak season, contracts with 3 different rail lines to move cattle east. He was 54 years old, had never been married, had the kind of face that looked perpetually dissatisfied, and he had made more money than he could reasonably spend by understanding one essential truth about land. The people who controlled water controlled everything else. Evelyn had met him twice, briefly, at community gatherings after Thomas died. Both times he had been courteous in a way that felt like a mask fitted over something less courteous. He had offered his condolences. He had asked, with what seemed like casual curiosity, whether she'd given any thought to her long-term plans for the ranch. She had answered vaguely and moved on. He had smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes and done the same. She hadn't thought much about it. She'd had too many other things to think about. Cole's first week on the Mercer Ranch was not graceful. This is worth saying clearly, because the temptation when looking back is to make things neater than they were. Cole Ashford was not a magic solution to Evelyn's problems. He was a man who showed up without a history and started working, and the working itself was messy and difficult and full of friction. Old Pete resented him immediately, not from malice, but from the particular resentment of someone who has been the most competent person in a small operation and suddenly isn't anymore. Pete had held the ranch together through sheer stubbornness since Thomas died, and he had done it his way, which was not always the most efficient way. When Cole quietly reorganized the morning feeding rotation to cut 2 hours off the daily labor, Pete spent 3 days finding passive ways to demonstrate his disapproval before finally confronting Cole directly by the water trough. "You've been here a week," Pete said. "This ranch been here 40 years. "I know it," Cole said. "Then maybe slow down with the reorganizing." Cole looked at him. "You want me to put it back?" Pete opened his mouth, closed it. I want you to show some respect for how things been done. I respect that it's been done, Cole said. I'm just trying to make it easier going forward. If you want to talk through the changes before I make them, I'll do that. Pete stared at him for a long moment. Fine, he said finally. We'll talk through it. They did. It was uncomfortable for about 2 more weeks, and then it wasn't. Danny Rourke was an easier case. He was 19 and had no pride to protect yet, only a desperate desire to get better at the work. And Cole taught without condescension, which was all Danny needed. Evelyn watched all of this from a careful distance. She had learned quickly that her instinct to manage every interaction was sometimes more hindrance than help. She gave Cole the space to find his place in the crew, stayed available if things went sideways, and spent the rest of her time dealing with the approximately 400 other problems demanding her attention. One evening, about 2 weeks after Cole arrived, she found him sitting on the fence rail near the east pasture, watching the cattle settle for the night. She came and stood beside the fence because she needed to check the pasture anyway, and if a conversation happened, it happened. "You settling in all right?" she asked. "Getting there." He was quiet for a moment. The cattle are good stock. Thomas knew what he was buying. It was the first time anyone had said Thomas's name to her in a way that was just informational, not weighted with pity or careful avoidance, just a fact. "He did," she said. "That was his gift. He could look at an animal and know its value better than any man I ever met." "What was yours?" She glanced at him. He was still watching the cattle, not her. The question hadn't been aggressive. It was just a question. "I'm still figuring that out," she said. He nodded, like that was a perfectly good answer. She told herself that night that she needed to stop reading things into the man. He was an employee. He was, by his own account, a drifter. He had a past he wouldn't discuss, and a future that was presumably one of those cases where you didn't ask. She had a ranch to save and a dead husband she still woke up reaching for in the dark. This was not the season for anything complicated. She was very certain about all of that. The fall roundup arrived on a Wednesday that felt like it had been designed specifically to test human endurance. The sky turned the color of old iron at dawn. The wind came out of the north carrying the first real promise of cold, and 300 cattle that had been grazing fat and content all summer suddenly remembered that they were prey animals with poor decision-making instincts and began behaving accordingly. They started in the north pasture where the grass was heaviest. Cole and Danny pushed the herd south while Pete managed the gate cut and Evelyn rode the east flank, keeping the animals from spreading into the rocky ground that bordered the creek. For 2 hours it was controlled chaos, which is the only kind of chaos in cattle work. Animals peeled off from the herd, got turned back, ran the wrong direction, were turned back again. There was a lot of dust and a lot of yelling and a lot of moments where things felt like they were about to go badly sideways. Then they reached the ravine. The creek had been running higher than usual, something Evelyn had noticed and filed away without fully examining, and where it curved along the south edge of the north pasture, the bank had eroded in the recent rains. The drop was steep, maybe 12 feet to churning water below, hidden from the cattle's line of approach by a fold in the grass. The lead animals hit the edge before anyone saw it coming. What happened next lasted maybe 45 seconds and felt like 45 minutes. The front third of the herd shoved against the lead animals from behind, momentum doing what momentum does. Several animals went over the edge before the herd could turn. The rest broke sideways in 2 panicking groups, which immediately threatened to drive more animals into the gap from the sides. Cole had been riding the west flank. He covered ground at a speed that didn't seem physically possible, pushing his mare hard to get ahead of the right side group before they completed the loop and hit the eroded section again. He turned them, barely, with maybe 10 yards to spare, then wheeled back for the left group while Danny, responding to what Cole was doing rather than any instruction, pushed the remaining animals back from the edge on the opposite side. Evelyn was already at the ravine. She counted 6 animals in the water below, fighting the current in the narrow channel. The creek was chest-high and fast. She didn't think about it. She tied her horse to the nearest solid post, dropped down the bank via a tree root that was probably not going to hold, and landed knee-deep in the creek beside an animal that was spinning in circles in seconds from going under completely. She got a rope around it, her hands knew the motion without her brain having to direct it, and got the animal's head up. Cole appeared above her on the bank. "I need anchor," she shouted. He was already tying off. He threw down a second rope and she attached it while he and Pete, who had arrived on foot, worked the animal up the bank with brute effort and the kind of profanity that gets reserved for extreme circumstances. All 6 animals came out of the water. It took 2 hours. 2 of them had injuries that would need attention. None of them died. When it was done, Evelyn sat on the creek bank with her boots still in the water and her lungs burning, and for about 30 seconds she let herself feel how close it had been. Then she stood up. Cole was a few yards away, breathing hard, his jacket soaked through. "Good riding," she said. He looked at her. Her soaking wet skirt, the rope burns starting to redden on both her hands. "You went in the water." "Someone had to." Most ranch owners would have stood on the bank and directed. "I don't have the patience for directing things I can do faster myself." He was quiet for a moment. "You've got good rope hands." "My father taught me," she said. Danny was grinning a few yards away with the specific glee of a 19-year-old who had survived something terrifying and was already turning it into a story. Pete was sitting on a rock looking exhausted and quietly proud. The cattle were contained and calm now, unbothered by their own near disaster in the way that cattle always were. It was not a perfect day. 2 animals were hurt, the south fence was going to need repair work where the herd had pushed through, and everyone was going to be sore tomorrow in places they didn't know it was possible to be sore. But the herd was alive. The ranch was standing, and for the first time since Thomas had died, Evelyn Mercer felt something that was not quite hope. She was too practical for hope just yet, but was at least the space where hope might eventually grow. She looked out across her land. The iron sky had broken a little in the west, and late light was coming through in long gold bars across the pasture. The cattle moved slowly in that light, easy and grazing, and for a moment the whole world was just that. Her land, her herd, the sound of water, and the quiet. Then she looked at the creek. It was still running high, but not as high as it had been yesterday. She filed that away. She had too much to do today to think about it. She shouldn't have waited. The creek kept dropping. Not fast enough to panic about on any given morning, but consistently, the way a fever drops degree by degree, and you tell yourself it's getting better until suddenly the patient stops sweating, and you realize it was never getting better at all. Evelyn noticed it first in the stock tank at the east end of the property, which the creek fed through a channel Thomas had dug 3 years ago. The tank had always run a little low in late summer, but by mid-October it should have been recovering. Instead, it sat at maybe 2/3 capacity and seemed to be losing ground. She mentioned it to Cole one morning while they were riding the fence line along the creek's eastern bank. "You see the tank level?" He nodded. He'd noticed. She was starting to understand that Cole noticed most things before she did, and simply waited to see if she'd arrive at them on her own. "It's been dropping since the roundup," she said. "Maybe before." "Maybe before," he agreed. "You think the dry spell's doing it?" Cole was quiet for a moment, looking at the water moving below them. The creek was maybe 8 inches lower than its normal autumn level. She could tell by the exposed rock along the bank, a pale ring of limestone that usually sat just at the waterline. "Could be the dry spell," he said. "Could be." She looked at him sideways. But the creek runs out of the high country. It's fed by snowmelt and springs, not just rain. A dry October shouldn't pull it down this much this fast. He paused. "I'd want to ride the upper stretch, see what it looks like above the property line." "That's Blackwell's land up there." "I know." Evelyn didn't say anything else about it that day, but she thought about it. She thought about the way Gideon Blackwell had looked at her at the harvest social 3 weeks ago. Not with hostility, exactly, but with the particular patience of a man who believes he's already won something and is simply waiting for the other party to realize it. She thought about that look for a long time. The conversation she hadn't wanted to have came to her instead, on a Friday afternoon in the form of Blackwell's foreman, a thick-necked man named Harlan Speece, who rode onto Mercer land without announcement and found Evelyn mending harness leather in the barn. "Mrs. Mercer." He pulled off his hat in a gesture that was technically polite. "Mr. Blackwell asked me to come by. Neighborly visit." "Neighbors usually send word first," Evelyn said, not stopping what she was doing. "Yep, well, Mr. Blackwell thought a casual approach might be better." Speece looked around the barn with the slow deliberateness of a man cataloging things. "He wanted me to ask how you're managing, the ranch and all, this being your first full season without your husband." "I'm managing fine." "Good. Good to hear." He turned his hat in his hands. Mr. Blackwell also wanted me to mention, and this is purely informal, you understand, no pressure intended, that he'd be willing to sit down and talk if you were ever considering your options. My options, Evelyn said flatly, just if the operation ever got to be more than you could handle, he'd pay a fair price. Better than fair. He's always admired this land. Evelyn set down the harness and looked at Spies directly. He was a big man, and he knew it, and he held himself in a way that was meant to take up space. She didn't let herself step back. You tell Mr. Blackwell that I appreciate his concern, she said, and that the Mercer Ranch is not for sale. Not this year, not next year, not any year he's likely to still be breathing. Spies smiled. It was an unpleasant smile. Ma'am, that's a real strong position for someone in your situation. What situation is that? He put his hat back on. Like I said, just a neighborly visit. He turned toward the door. You find that water's getting short this winter. You know where to send word. He rode out. Evelyn stood in the barn doorway and watched him go. And the thing building in her chest was not quite fear and not quite rage, but some compound of both that sat behind her sternum like a heated stone. Cole was at the fence rail where she'd expected him to be. She walked over and told him about the conversation, keeping her voice level because the alternative was throwing something. When she finished, Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, he mentioned the water. He did? Before you said anything about it. She hadn't clocked that. She replayed the conversation in her head. Spies had mentioned water at the end. You find that water's getting short, as if he already knew something was wrong with it. Yes, she said. He did. Cole nodded slowly. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise, she thought. Recognition, like a piece had just found its place. We need to ride the upper creek, he said. Tomorrow? Tonight would be better. They left at dusk. Cole, Evelyn, and Danny, who was young enough to find the secrecy exciting rather than frightening. They rode north along the creek, staying close to the bank, threading through cottonwood and willow as the light went gray and then dark. The temperature dropped fast and their breath clouded. The horses moved carefully in the dim light. The Mercer property line ran along a ridge of limestone about 2 miles north of the main house. Beyond it, the land became Blackwell's. Steeper, rockier, the creek narrowing as it wound down from higher ground. They crossed the ridge line and kept riding. Cole spotted it first. He held up a hand and they stopped. He pointed upstream without speaking. In the darkness, it took Evelyn a moment to see what he was indicating. And then she did. The creek, which should have been a single channel 8 to 10 feet wide at this elevation, had been interrupted. A earthen dam had been built into the bank, crude but effective, redirecting the main flow into a new channel that curved west, away from the natural course, away from Mercer land, into what she assumed was a new holding pond on Blackwell's property. It wasn't finished. 3 men were still working on it by lantern light, moving with the urgency of people who wanted to be done before someone noticed. Evelyn started to push her horse forward. Cole's arm came out and blocked her. Not rough, but firm. Wait, he said quietly. That's my water. I know, but there are 3 of them and 3 of us, and one of us is 19 years old. He kept his voice low. And if we ride in there angry, we get a fight. A fight we might win tonight and lose everywhere else. What does that mean? It means Blackwell's counting on you to do something he can use against you. We ride down there, somebody throws a punch or pulls a gun, and suddenly the story is about what happened on his land in the dark, not about what he's doing to your water. Evelyn stared at the men working below. Her jaw was tight. So we just watch. We watch. We remember exactly what we see, and then we decide what to do with it. It was possibly the hardest thing she'd done since Thomas died. Sitting on that ridge, watching men take something from her while the cold worked its way through her coat, and Danny shifted nervously on his horse beside her. She counted the workers, noted the lantern positions, estimated how far along the diversion was. She looked at where the new channel curved and calculated how much water it was already pulling. Most of it. That was the answer. It was pulling most of it. They rode back in silence. At the property line, Danny said, "What do we do?" And neither adult answered him right away. Back at the ranch, they sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low. Pete had been roused and sat across from Evelyn with his big hands wrapped around a coffee cup, listening to what Cole and Evelyn described. His face did the thing old ranch hands' faces do when they're angry. It went very still, very flat, all the expression drawn inward. He can't just take it, Pete said. He's not taking it openly, Cole said. He's diverting it. Probably going to claim later that the channel shifted naturally, or that the water never belonged to us in the first place. That's nonsense. That creek's been running through Mercer land longer than Blackwell's been in the territory. Doesn't matter what's true if he can make it a question, Cole said. He's got lawyers, he's got money. He doesn't need to be right. He just needs to make it complicated enough that Evelyn runs out of resources fighting it. The room was quiet. Evelyn had been staring at the table. Now she looked up. How long until the diversion's complete? Cole thought about it. The way they were moving, a week, maybe less. Once it's done, it'll look like it's been there. And the cattle? 3 weeks before it gets serious, maybe 4 if the weather stays mild. He paused. But winter's coming. If the creek's fully diverted before the first freeze, you won't have surface water through the cold months. The tank won't refill. By spring, he stopped. By spring, there's no ranch, Evelyn finished. Nobody argued with that. She stood up and walked to the window. The yard was dark and cold-looking, the outbuildings just shapes in the moonlight. She had a sudden, vivid memory of Thomas standing at the same window the night before he died, looking out at the same darkness with a coffee cup in his hand, saying something she couldn't quite remember now, something ordinary about fencing or weather or one of the horses. Just an ordinary thing. And then the next morning he was gone, and the ordinary was gone with him. She pressed that thought down hard. We go back, she said, tonight. Evelyn, Cole started, not to fight. She turned from the window, to make sure they know we've seen it, and to make sure they stop working while we figure out what to do. Cole studied her. That's a different thing than what I thought you meant. I know. She held his gaze. Can you do that? Go back there and make them stop without it turning into something it shouldn't. He was quiet long enough that she started to think he'd say no. Then he nodded, once. I can try. They left Pete with the horses and went back in with Danny, who was trying hard to look older than he was and almost succeeding. They came down from the ridge openly this time, no attempt at concealment, and the 3 workers saw them coming by the lantern light and straightened up with the particular wariness of men doing something they know is wrong. The tallest of the 3 stepped forward. He had a rifle slung across his back and his hand drifted toward it in a way that was probably unconscious but read clearly as a threat. Cole rode ahead of Evelyn and stopped about 15 feet from the man. He didn't reach for anything. He sat relaxed in his saddle, hands visible, and he spoke with the same quiet, unhurried voice he used when he was explaining something to Danny about cattle work. You're going to stop work on this dam tonight, he said. The man's chin came up. This is Blackwell land. You got no say in what The dam's on the property line, Cole said, which means it might be on Blackwell land and it might not. That's a question for people with surveying equipment and legal authority, neither of which you have at, he paused, 9:15 on a Friday night. He looked at the other 2 workers who hadn't moved. I'm going to come back in the morning. If the dam's been extended past its current point, I'm going to have a conversation with the county sheriff that none of you want to be part of. That a threat? The first man said. It's a fact, Cole said pleasantly. Those are different things. The 3 men looked at each other. The kind of look that happens when people are doing a rapid calculation about whether the thing they're being paid to do is worth what it's starting to feel like it might cost. The tall man turned back to Cole. We're knocking off for the night anyway. Good, Cole said. Sleep well. He turned his horse and rode back toward the ridge. Evelyn fell in beside him. Behind her, she could hear the workers talking in low voices, but she didn't look back. When they were over the ridge and out of hearing, she let out a long, slow breath. That could have gone different. Could have, Cole agreed. You weren't afraid of that gun. He thought about that for a moment. I was aware of it. That's not the same thing. No, he said. It's not. She wanted to ask him why. What kind of life made a man calmly aware of a gun being in the room without being afraid of it? But she'd learned enough about Cole Ashford in 2 months to know that question had a door behind it that he wasn't going to open tonight. So she let it alone. They rode back through the dark. The creek ran alongside them for a while, quieter than it should have been, and Evelyn listened to it with a kind of helpless fury she couldn't fully name. Water didn't know it was being stolen. It just went where it was directed. It didn't fight back. It just diminished. She wasn't going to diminish. Back at the ranch, she sent Danny to bed and sat with Cole and Pete at the kitchen table for another hour, working through what they knew and what they needed. Pete had thoughts about the county sheriff, most of them negative. The sheriff was a man named Adler, who had been re-elected twice with Blackwell money, and who would find a way to be unhelpful without being outright corrupt. Cole thought the better path was the Territorial Land Office in Laramie, which operated with more distance from local influence. But that was a 3-day ride and required paperwork they didn't currently have. What they needed, Cole said, was documentation. Evidence that Harlan Creek had served the Mercer Ranch continuously and without dispute. Survey records. Witness accounts. Something that could walk into a land office and speak louder than Blackwell's lawyers. Thomas's father might have had survey records, Evelyn said. There's a trunk in the attic. I haven't gone through it properly. That'd be a start, Cole said. What else? Neighbors. Anyone who's been in the valley long enough to remember how this creek's always run. He looked at her steadily. This is going to take time we probably don't have a lot of. How much time do we have? He thought about it with the focused gravity of a man who is measuring something real. They finish the dam. Really finish it. Before the first freeze, 6 weeks. Maybe 8. After that, the cattle start suffering and there's no good answer except to sell or lose them. If they don't finish it before we can get legal documentation in front of the right people. He paused. Then we might have something. Evelyn looked at Pete. Pete looked back with the expression of a man who was 63 years old and had watched enough bad winters to know when one was coming. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. All right, Evelyn said. She stood up. The lamp was burning low and the kitchen was full of shadows. Pete, tomorrow I need you to check the trunk in the attic. Any papers, any documents, anything with surveyor's marks or dates on it, I need to know what's there. She looked at Cole. We ride back at dawn to check whether they've stopped. And if they haven't, then we figure out the next thing. She picked up the lamp. Go to sleep, both of you. Tomorrow's going to be long. She went upstairs and lay on the bed without undressing, staring at the ceiling in the dark. The house made its old house noises around her, settling, creaking, the wind finding gaps in the siding that Thomas had been meaning to fix and never got to. She thought about the creek, about the pale ring of exposed limestone, about the way the water had sounded tonight, shallow and diminished, running over rocks that were usually underwater. She thought about Gideon Blackwell sitting somewhere comfortable, patient as stone, watching the season do what he'd set it up to do. She thought about what Cole had said. He doesn't need to be right. He just needs to make it complicated enough that you run out of resources fighting it. She thought about Thomas and the ordinary things she couldn't remember, and the way grief had a way of turning up at the worst possible times just to remind you it was still there. She wasn't going to let this ranch die. She'd decided that months ago, and nothing that had happened since had changed the math of it. If anything, what happened tonight had clarified something she hadn't been able to name before. She wasn't just holding the ranch together out of stubbornness or pride or some obligation to Thomas's memory. She wanted it. For herself. This land, this sky, this creek that someone had decided to steal. It was hers. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind had picked up and she could hear it moving through the dry grass of the pasture, a sound like something breathing. Somewhere down the road, Gideon Blackwell was probably sleeping soundly. He thought he had time on his side. He thought weather and grief and isolation would do his work for him without him ever having to stand in the open and take credit for it. He hadn't counted on Cole Ashford, and he hadn't counted on Evelyn Mercer deciding that this was the fight she was going to make her name on, whatever that cost her. She slept. Not well, but enough. Pete found the trunk. It was pushed to the back of the attic behind 3 crates of Thomas's father's books and a broken rocking chair that nobody had gotten around to throwing away. Pete dragged it to the attic stairs by himself, which took 20 minutes, and left him with a pulled muscle in his lower back that he didn't mention to anyone for 2 days. And then he and Evelyn went through it on the kitchen table while the morning light came through the east window in long, pale bars. Most of it was what you'd expect from a family that had ranched the same land for 2 generations. Old receipts, correspondence with suppliers, a ledger from the late 1860s with Thomas's grandfather's handwriting in it, cramped and urgent and difficult to read. There were letters from back east, a small photograph of a woman Evelyn didn't recognize, a record of cattle sales going back to 1871. And at the bottom, folded into thirds and wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had kept it dry, a hand-drawn survey map dated 1868. Evelyn unfolded it carefully on the table and smoothed it flat. The ink had faded to a brownish gray in places, but was still legible. The map showed the original Mercer land grant, smaller than the current ranch, before Thomas's father had bought the adjacent parcels, with the creek marked as a thick wavy line running north to south through the eastern portion of the property. In the margin, in a neat surveyor's hand, someone had written, Harlan Creek, principal water source, continuous flow, established use by grantee, surveyed and confirmed August 14th, 1868. Evelyn read it twice. Then she looked up at Pete. "This is something," she said. "It's a start," Pete said carefully. He'd learned from 63 years of Wyoming winters not to call something a salvation until he was sure it wasn't a mirage. She brought the map to Cole, who was in the barn working on a broken harness buckle, with the focused attention he brought to everything he did with his hands. He set the work down and studied the map for a long time without speaking. 1868, he said finally. Blackwell's been in the territory since, 68, 69? 68, Cole said, which means this survey predates him. He folded the map back along its original creases, careful with it. This is good, but it's not enough. Evelyn had expected him to say that. Why not? Because it shows use in 1868. Blackwell's lawyers will argue that circumstances change, that water rights can shift, that the informal agreements made over 15 years amount to abandonment of the original claim. He handed the map back to her. We need witnesses, people who can testify that this creek has served your ranch continuously, not just in 1868, right up through today. Who's been here that long? That's what we need to find out. What followed was a week of conversations that Evelyn hadn't expected to be as painful as they were. She rode to neighboring homesteads with Cole, asking questions of people who had watched her struggle through the past 8 months with varying degrees of sympathy and varying degrees of the particular helplessness that frontier communities felt when one of their own was going under. Several neighbors were willing to speak to what they knew, but had no specific memory of the creek's history. 2 of them, the Hargrove family to the south, who had been friendly with Thomas, actually had detailed recollections but were nervous about putting themselves on record against Blackwell, whose economic reach in the valley was long and whose memory for grievances was reportedly longer. I understand, Evelyn told Margaret Hargrove, sitting in the woman's kitchen over coffee that was mostly chicory. I'm not asking you to do something that puts your family at risk. Margaret Hargrove was a small, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had homesteaded this valley before most of the current ranchers arrived. She looked at Evelyn for a moment with an expression that mixed sympathy with something harder and more practical. My husband says we can't afford to cross Blackwell. I know, but... Margaret wrapped both hands around her cup. I've been watching that creek run past the eastern edge of this property for 22 years. I know exactly where it goes, and I know it's always gone to your land. She set her cup down. My husband talks to me in the mornings. What I decide to do on an afternoon when he's working, that's my business. She gave them a written statement, 3 paragraphs in careful schoolteacher cursive, attesting to Harlan Creek's consistent course and use over 22 years of personal observation. She signed her name at the bottom with a firmness that suggested she'd made her peace with the decision. It was one statement. They needed more. Cole, writing back in the late afternoon, said something Evelyn hadn't expected. There's an old Arapaho family living up near the North Ridge, 2-3 miles past where the creek bends. Family named Walks Far. They've been on that ground longer than any white settler in this valley. Evelyn looked at him. You know them? Met the oldest son once, years back. Good man. A pause. They've watched that creek since before your grandfather-in-law filed a claim on anything. Will they talk to us? I don't know, he said honestly, but they might, if you ask right. How do I ask right? Cole thought about it for a moment. You go without Speece riding behind you. You don't act like you're doing them a favor by showing up. You tell them exactly what's happening and why you need help, and you let them decide. They went the following morning, just the 2 of them. The Walks Far family's camp was modest and orderly, set back from the tree line in a way that was neither hidden nor conspicuous. And the man who came out to meet them was perhaps 60 years old, with a face that had the particular quality of someone who had seen a great many things and stopped being surprised by most of them. His name was Joseph Walks Far. He had a younger man with him, a son, Evelyn guessed, who said nothing but listened with complete attention. Evelyn told Joseph Walks Far the whole of it without softening any part. The diversion dam. Blackwell's strategy. What they needed and why. She didn't ask him to help. She just told him what was true. Joseph Walks Far listened to all of it, then was silent for long enough that she started to think the answer was no. That creek, he said finally, my father's father used to fish in it. When the Mercer family first came and built on the lower ground, my grandfather went and talked to the old man who was building. They agreed the family could use the lower reach for their cattle, and our people would still have the upper. That agreement was never put on paper, but it was kept. For 40 years. He looked at Evelyn steadily. The man who wants to take your water. He has not kept agreements with us either. He gave them a statement. His son signed it as a witness. They rode back with 2 pieces of paper in Evelyn's coat pocket, and the particular fragile feeling of having received something that couldn't be replaced. It was Cole who found the 3rd witness, and it happened by accident. They had stopped at a way station north of the valley to water the horses, and the man running the station turned out to be a retired land surveyor named August Pruitt, who had done contract work for the territorial government in the early 1870s and had personally surveyed the upper reach of Harlan Creek in 1872 as part of a broader water mapping project. He was in his 70s now, arthritic, and delighted to have visitors. I remember that creek, Pruitt said, settling into his chair with the authority of a man who has earned opinions about every subject. Good, consistent flow, fed by 3 separate springs up in the high country, which is why it runs reliable even in dry years. He paused. Or should. What's it running like now? Evelyn told him. Pruitt's eyes sharpened. That's not drought, he said. 3 springs can't all go dry at once in October. Something's diverting it. He looked at Cole. You've seen this diversion? Saw it being built, Cole said. On the property line? Or near it? Hard to say exactly without survey equipment. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up, with more difficulty than he'd sat down, and went to a back room. He came back with a rolled map that was considerably more detailed than the one from Thomas's grandfather's trunk. He spread it on the table and pointed. Survey I did in 72. The creek's center line is marked here, here, and here. If someone's built a diversion on Blackwell's side of the property line, it should be about 40 yards west of this point. He tapped the map. If it's east of this point, it's on Mercer land. Either way, the water rights follow the original channel regardless of where a new dam is built. You'd have standing to challenge it. He rolled the map back up and held it out to Evelyn. Take it. I've got the field notes to back it up. She looked at the rolled map in the old man's hands. You'd testify to this? I'm old and I'm bored, and I've been watching men like Blackwell cheat honest ranchers since before you were born, Pruitt said. Yes, I'd testify. They were 3 days out from the ranch now, working their way back through mountain passes that had begun showing the first light dustings of snow at the higher elevations. The weather was turning faster than expected, and Evelyn could feel the pressure of the deadline tightening with each day. Somewhere behind them, Blackwell's men were either continuing the dam work or waiting to see what she would do next. On the second night of the return ride, they camped at the edge of a stand of pine near a small tributary stream. The fire small because neither of them wanted to advertise their position in country that belonged to people who might have an interest in their whereabouts. The horses were picketed close. The sky above the pines was thick with stars. Evelyn was feeding small sticks to the fire when Cole said, without preamble, I used to do this work, survey work. She looked up. He was looking at the fire, not at her. Before ranching? Before a lot of things. He turned a stick slowly in his fingers. I worked for the territorial government out of Colorado, survey and land assessment. Did it for 4 years. This was more than he'd offered about his past in 2 months of working together. She kept her voice even. What happened to it? A pause. Got complicated. He set the stick down. There was a dispute. Similar to this one, actually. A man named Farrow was diverting water from 3 smaller operations north of Pueblo. I did the survey that proved it, filed the report. He stopped. And? And Pharaoh had friends in the territorial office that I didn't know about. The report got buried. The smaller operations lost. He looked up at the sky. I quit after that. Figured if the work could be made useless that easily, it wasn't worth doing. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. But you kept the knowledge. You keep what you know, whether you use it or not. She thought about that, about the survey map in her coat pocket, and Prewitt's rolled field notes in her saddlebag, and the 2 signed statements from people who had nothing to gain from helping her and had done it anyway. Is that why you didn't tell me you knew water law when you first saw the creek dropping? Cole was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. I wasn't sure I wanted to go back into it, he said finally. That kind of work. What it cost last time. What changed your mind? He looked at her. In the firelight, his face was all shadow and angles. The tiredness she'd noticed on that first day present, but different now. Not the tiredness of someone who'd given up, but the tiredness of someone who'd made a decision. Spies rode onto your land like he owned it already, Cole said. Like the outcome was already settled and you just hadn't gotten the news. He picked up another stick and turned it in his fingers. I don't like men who move like the outcome's already settled. The fire popped. Something moved in the pines. A branch, probably, the wind picking up. Evelyn looked at the fire and felt the warmth of it on her face and the cold of the night at her back, that particular frontier sensation of being caught between 2 different climates at once. She said, I was wrong about why I hired you. He looked at her. How's that? I told myself it was because I was desperate, because you were there and you could work. She poked at the fire with a stick. But that wasn't really it. What was it? She thought about how to say it accurately. You looked at me like I was a person, she said, not a problem or a situation or a thing to be managed, just a person who had a question and deserved a straight answer. She paused. I hadn't had that in a while. Cole was quiet for a moment. The fire settled lower. You're easier to look at straight than most people, he said. It wasn't a pretty thing to say. It wasn't smooth or carefully crafted. It was just true, stated plainly, in the way he stated most things, which was exactly why it landed the way it did. She didn't say anything back. She didn't think she needed to. They rode out the next morning before full light, pushing hard toward home because the sky had a gray weight to it that promised weather within 48 hours. The horses were tired but willing. Evelyn rode with the documents wrapped in oilcloth inside her coat against her chest, where she could feel them with every step the horse took. An hour outside of the valley, Cole pulled up and pointed west. On the high ridge above Blackwell's land, 2 riders were moving parallel to their course, keeping pace without closing distance, watching. Blackwell's men? Evelyn asked. Most likely. They going to be a problem? Cole watched the riders for a moment. They're far enough that they can't see what we're carrying. They're close enough to remind us they're there. He looked at her. It's a message. What message? That he knows you've been out collecting something, and that he's not done yet. He clicked his horse forward. We need to get to the land office before he does. They didn't speak much for the rest of the ride. The gray sky made good on its promise around noon, and it began to snow. Not heavily, but steadily, the kind of snow that didn't care about your timeline. The horses moved slower on the wet ground. The documents against Evelyn's chest felt heavier with every mile. She thought about what Cole had said around the fire, about the survey work in Colorado, about a report that got buried, and men who moved like the outcome was already settled. She thought about what it cost a person to walk away from work they were good at, because the work had been turned against the people it was supposed to help. She thought, he came back to it for me, and then corrected herself. He came back to it for the ranch, and then allowed that both things could be true without one diminishing the other. The valley came into view in the late afternoon, the familiar ridgeline dropping down to the broad pasture land, the dark line of Harlan Creek visible even from this distance, or what should have been Harlan Creek. From up here, she could see the east pasture clearly and the creek's course where it ran along the property boundary. It was barely a thread. In the 2 weeks she'd been riding and gathering, the diversion had continued. The creek that should have been running strong at the start of November was reduced to a trickling shadow of itself, running shallow over exposed rock, and the stock tank at the east end, even at this distance, was visibly lower than before. Evelyn stopped her horse, just for a moment. just to look at it. Cole stopped beside her without being asked. He looked at the same thing she was looking at and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything useful to say. The damage was real, and it was progressing, and saying so wouldn't slow it down. She felt the documents against her chest. 16 days of writing, 3 witnesses. A survey map from 1868 and field notes from 1872, and the careful cursive of a woman who'd made her decision on a quiet afternoon. A former surveyor's rolled maps and a 60-year-old Arapaho man who remembered what his grandfather had told him about agreements that got kept. It wasn't nothing. It was, in fact, more than most people in her position would have been able to gather. But the land office in Laramie was still 2 days away. Blackwell had a week's head start with his lawyers, at minimum. And the snow coming down around her right now was going to make the ride harder, not easier. She looked at Cole. He was already looking at her. "We keep going," she said. It wasn't a question. "We keep going," he said. She put her heels to her horse and rode down into the valley toward the ranch, the snow coming steady now, covering everything in a thin, indifferent white, and the creek below her running thin and quiet and waiting to see what the people who needed it were going to do. They had one night at the ranch before they had to leave again. Evelyn spent most of it at the kitchen table going through the documents with Cole, organizing everything into a sequence that told the story clearly. Not just the facts, but the facts in the right order, because she understood instinctively that a story badly told could lose even when the truth was on its side. The 1868 survey map went first, then Prewitt's 1872 field notes, which confirmed the creek's course and established the spring-fed nature of its flow. Then Margaret Hargrove's statement, then Joseph Walk's FARS, each one a layer of testimony that the creek's use had been continuous, uncontested, and long established before Gideon Blackwell had ever filed a single piece of paper claiming otherwise. Pete sat at the far end of the table with coffee and said little, but his presence was steady, and Evelyn was grateful for it. Danny had gone to bed early because he was 19 and couldn't quite conceal that the paperwork portion of this fight held less appeal for him than the writing in the dark portion had. Cole read through everything twice with the focused quiet of a man who had done this kind of work before and remembered exactly how it could go wrong. He reorganized 2 of the documents without explaining why, and Evelyn let him because she trusted his judgment on this specific terrain in the way she trusted Pete's judgment about cattle. It was earned expertise, and she had the sense to recognize it. Blackwell's attorney is a man named Croft, Cole said. He'd learned this from the way station operator, who knew most of the valley's legal business the way station operators always did. He's filed claims for Blackwell before. He's good at finding technical problems with opposing documents. What kind of technical problems? Improper witnessing, missing notarization, chain of custody issues, documents that can't be authenticated. Cole looked up from the papers. Most of what we have would survive that. Prewitt's notes are official government survey records. Hargrove's statement has 2 witnesses. Walk's FARS is properly signed. He paused. But Croft's better move is going to be arguing the underlying law. Not that our documents are invalid, that they don't matter. How does 40 years of use not matter? He'll argue prior appropriation, that Blackwell filed first and his filing supersedes historical use. Can he do that? He can argue it. Whether it holds depends on how well we argue back. Cole looked at her directly. That's why we need to be in that office before his paperwork becomes the established record. Once they accept his filing as the baseline, we're fighting uphill. She already knew this. She'd known it since the night they sat at this same table after coming back from the ridge. But hearing it stated plainly at midnight with 2 days of hard riding ahead made it feel different, more immediate, more breakable. She rolled the survey map back into its oilcloth and pressed the crease flat. What time do we leave? Before light, Cole said. The snow's going to slow us on the high pass. We need every hour. She nodded. She stood up and looked at the documents spread across her kitchen table. The accumulated evidence of weeks of writing and the accumulated history of 2 generations. And for a moment she felt the full weight of what she was carrying. Not just the paper, the ranch, the cattle standing in the east pasture drinking from a creek that was barely adequate and getting worse. Pete, who had spent his whole adult life working this land and deserved to finish it in peace. Danny, who was just starting. Thomas, who had loved this ground with a plain-spoken devotion that he'd never been good at putting into words but had demonstrated every day by the quality of his work. She picked up the documents and took them to her room and put them under the bed. which was perhaps not the most sophisticated document security system in the territory, but was where she could reach them without thinking if something happened in the night. She was up before Cole. She had coffee made when he came down, and she handed him a cup without comment, and they drank in the dark kitchen while the ranch slept around them. "You ready?" she said. "Are you?" She thought about it honestly, which she preferred to the false comfort of automatic reassurance. "No," she said, "but I'm going anyway." He almost smiled at that. Almost. They rode out into a cold that had teeth. The high pass that connected the valley to the road south toward Laramie was manageable in good weather and unpleasant in everything else. In early November, with 2 inches of fresh snow on the ground and more coming in the clouds building to the northwest, it was the kind of ride that made a person understand exactly why the frontier had such a high attrition rate. The horses labored through the deeper drifts on the upper approach, and there were 2 stretches where Evelyn dismounted and led hers rather than push the animal through uncertain footing on a steep traverse. Cole led the first stretch, and she followed his line exactly, watching where he put his feet, not because she couldn't find her own path, but because he'd been up this way before, and she hadn't, and this was not a morning for pride. On the far side of the pass, the road widened and the snow thinned, and they were able to push to a better pace. They rode hard through the afternoon, stopping once at a stream crossing to water the horses and eat the food Pete had packed without being asked: cold biscuits and dried beef, both of which tasted better than they had any right to under the circumstances. Sitting on a rock beside the stream, eating, Evelyn said, "Tell me about the case in Colorado, the Faro case." Cole looked at her. "Why?" "Because I want to know what we're walking into, what it looked like when it went wrong." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. Faro had 3 men in the territorial office. Not corrupt exactly. They weren't being paid off. But Faro was the kind of man who did enough business in the right places that people owed him favors without quite knowing how they'd gotten into the position. He paused. "The survey I filed was accurate. Everything was in order. But Croft, not the same Croft, different man, same type, found a procedural issue with the original claim documentation that technically put the water rights in question. And once that question existed, the men in the office who owed Faro favors found reasons to table the matter indefinitely." "Indefinitely," Evelyn said. "The smaller operations were dead by spring. Once they failed, the question became moot." Evelyn looked at her biscuit for a moment. "That's what Blackwell's counting on. Not winning the case, just delaying it." "Yes." "So how do we beat that?" Cole turned his coffee cup in his hands. "We don't give them anything to table. We present it so completely, so thoroughly documented, that there's no procedural gap to exploit." He looked at her. "And we need the commissioner himself to hear it, not a deputy, not a clerk. Horace Langley. He's been in that office 18 years, and he is genuinely not beholden to anyone because he is genuinely too stubborn to be." A pause. "He's also not easy to deal with." "Is he honest?" "As a post." "Then I'll manage him," Evelyn said. She said it with a certainty that she didn't entirely feel, but she had learned in the past year that certainty was sometimes a thing you projected first and grew into second, and that was close enough. They reached Laramie late on the second day, the town coming up out of the plain in the fading light as a collection of wooden buildings and yellow lamp glow that felt almost warm after 2 days on cold mountain roads. They found a boarding house on the main street, 2 rooms, and Evelyn spent 20 minutes at the wash basin trying to get the road off her face and hands before giving up on total victory and settling for better than before. She slept better than she expected. Maybe because there was nothing more to do until morning. Maybe because she was simply too exhausted to lie awake worrying. She was up at first light and in the street before Cole had finished breakfast, and he found her standing in front of the Territorial Land Office 30 minutes before it opened, her documents in the leather satchel Pete had dug out from somewhere in the barn, watching the door. "It's not open yet," Cole said. "I know. You want coffee while we wait?" "No." He stood beside her, and they waited. The land office opened at 8. The clerk who unlocked the door was a young man of perhaps 25 who looked at them both with the blank professionalism of someone trained to treat all visitors with identical mild courtesy, regardless of what they wanted or how intensely they wanted it. He showed them into a waiting area with 2 wooden chairs and told them that Commissioner Langley would be available at 9 o'clock. At 9:15, they were still in the chairs. At 9:30, Cole got up and spoke to the clerk. Evelyn couldn't hear what he said, but his voice was quiet and his manner was matter-of-fact. And the clerk, when he went back to his desk, did something that resulted in Horace Langley appearing in the doorway of his inner office at 9:35. Langley was 60 years old and built like a man who had once been larger and had not yet fully adjusted to being smaller. He had thick white eyebrows and the look of someone who had heard every possible version of every possible land dispute and had stopped being interested in any of them approximately a decade ago. He looked at Evelyn, then at Cole, then at the satchel. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. It was not a question. He already knew who she was. "Commissioner." She stood up and met him with her hand out, which seemed to mildly surprise him. "Thank you for seeing us. You have documents?" Again, not a question. "I do." He held the door open. "Come in then." The inner office was cluttered in the way of offices where real work gets done. Stacks of maps, thick folders of paperwork, 2 coffee cups at different stages of completion. Langley sat behind his desk, and Evelyn sat across from him, and Cole took a position to her left, slightly back, in the way of someone who is present as a resource rather than a principal. Evelyn noticed he did it deliberately and was grateful. She laid the documents out in the order she and Cole had organized the night before. The 1868 survey map first. She explained what it was, what it confirmed, who had done the survey, and under what authority. Langley looked at it with the distant expression of a man reading something he's already familiar with from a different angle. Prewitt's 1872 field notes, second. "Here." Langley leaned forward slightly. "August Prewitt," he said. "He's still alive?" "Yes, sir. Running a way station north of the valley. He'd testify in person if required." Langley looked at the field notes with more attention than he'd given the survey map. "I know Prewitt's work," he said. "He's meticulous." It wasn't quite a compliment. It was more like a statement of confirmed fact. Margaret Hargrove's statement. Joseph Walksfar's statement. Evelyn watched Langley's face as he read each one. His expression didn't change significantly, but there was a quality of attention that shifted. The difference between a man going through motions and a man actually reading. He read the Walksfar statement twice. Then he set everything down and looked at Evelyn. "Gideon Blackwell filed a prior appropriation claim on Harlan Creek 11 days ago," he said, "through attorney Warren Croft. 11 days. She'd been on the road for most of that, riding in the opposite direction, gathering what she was now laying on this desk. He had 11 days on her." "I'm aware of Mr. Blackwell's filing," she said, keeping her voice level. "I'm contesting it." "On what grounds?" "Established prior use. Continuous and uncontested use of Harlan Creek by the Mercer Ranch dating to 1868, predating Mr. Blackwell's presence in this territory by several months. Survey records, field notes from an official territorial survey, and sworn testimony from multiple long-standing witnesses." Langley looked at the documents again, then at Cole. "You're the ranch hand?" "I work for Mrs. Mercer," Cole said. "You organized these documents." "I helped." Langley looked back at Evelyn. "Croft's going to argue that informal use doesn't constitute legal water rights. He's going to argue that Blackwell's formal filing supersedes historical practice." He said it flatly, without apparent opinion about whether he found this argument compelling. He's going to argue that the 1868 survey predates the Territorial Water Code established in 1873 and is therefore, the 1873 Water Code explicitly preserved existing use rights established before its passage, Cole said quietly. Section 4, paragraph 2. It was included specifically to prevent established operations from being disadvantaged by the new filing system. Langley turned and looked at Cole with slightly more interest than before. "You know the code." "I used to do this work." "Survey work?" "Survey and land assessment. Colorado Territory, 4 years. A pause. Something moved behind Langley's white eyebrows. "Name?" "Cole Ashford." A longer pause. "I've seen that name on a survey report." Cole said nothing. "Faro water dispute, Pueblo County, 79. Langley looked at him steadily. "That report was accurate. The outcome was—" He stopped. "Unfortunate." "Yes," Cole said. "It was." Langley was quiet for a moment. Then he looked back at the documents on his desk, and something in his manner had shifted. Not dramatically, not the kind of shift you could point to and name, But Evelyn, who had spent the past 2 months learning to read the subtle changes in this man's face, felt it clearly. The door opened behind them without a knock, which told her everything about who it was before she turned around. Warren Croft was a slim man in a dark coat that was better quality than everything else in the room, including the furniture. He was perhaps 45, with the kind of face that was assembled from individually unremarkable features into a whole that projected precision and mild disdain. He had a younger man with him carrying a leather case. He looked at Evelyn first, then at the documents on Langley's desk, and his expression did a brief, controlled thing that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. "Commissioner," he said pleasantly, "I wasn't aware there was a meeting scheduled today regarding the Blackwell filing." "There wasn't," Langley said. "Then perhaps we could reschedule Mrs. Mercer's—" "Mrs. Mercer is presenting a contest filing," Langley said, "which she has every right to do under territorial code. Sit down, Mr. Croft, or stand. Either way, we're proceeding." Croft sat down. His younger man remained standing near the door. Croft looked at the documents on the desk with the steady, cataloging attention of a man assessing opposition, and Evelyn watched him do it. She saw him register the 1868 survey map, saw him register the Prewitt field notes, saw very briefly something recalibrate behind his eyes. "Evelyn," Cole said quietly beside her. Just her name. She glanced at him, and he gave her a small nod. "Your turn." She turned back to Langley and began. She had not prepared a speech, because prepared speeches sounded like prepared speeches. And she understood instinctively that Horace Langley was the kind of man who trusted people who talked like people, rather than documents. She spoke about the ranch the way she actually knew it. The creek in autumn, when the cottonwood leaves came down and floated in the current. The way the stock tank filled by December when the upper springs were running strong. The 40 years of uninterrupted use that nobody had ever thought to contest because it had simply been the fact of things. The way the sun rising in the east was the fact of things. She talked about Thomas's grandfather breaking the original ground and digging the channel that fed the stock tank. She talked about Margaret Hargrove watching the creek from her kitchen window for 22 years. She talked about Joseph Walks Farr and the agreement his grandfather had made with a Mercer she'd never met, kept faithfully for 4 decades, because that was what the people in this valley did with agreements when they made them in good faith. Croft interrupted twice. Both times Langley held up a hand and Croft stopped, not happily. When she finished, Langley was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Croft. Response. Croft straightened his coat. "Commissioner, with respect, historical anecdote is not equivalent to legal standing. The prior appropriation doctrine established by the 1873 Code, Section 4, Cole said. Croft turned and looked at Cole with the particular displeasure of someone who objects to being interrupted by a man in a worn jacket. "I'm sorry?" "Section 4, Paragraph 2 of the 1873 Code," Cole said. "Preservation of existing use rights. If you're going to cite the code, cite all of it. My client's filing is the legally operative document. Your client's filing was made 11 days ago. The Mercer Ranch's water use has been documented continuously since 1868, 5 years before your client even arrived in this territory." Cole's voice remained perfectly even. Prior appropriation applies to competing new claims, not to established use that predates the code itself. Your client knew that when he filed. This isn't a good faith dispute over ambiguous rights. It's an attempt to use the filing system to manufacture a claim that doesn't exist. The room was quiet. Croft looked at Cole for a moment with the expression of a man reassessing what he was dealing with. Then he looked at Langley. "Commissioner, I'd need time to review the documentation being presented and prepare a formal—" "You've had 11 days, Langley said. "I wasn't aware there would be a contest filing today. Mr. Croft." Langley's voice carried the weight of 18 years of patience that had worn down to something harder underneath. "I have a survey map from 1868 with the creek's course documented by a licensed surveyor. I have field notes from 1872 by August Prewitt, whose work I am personally familiar with and whose accuracy I would not enjoy defending against in any court in this territory. I have sworn testimony from 2 long-standing witnesses with no legal interest in the outcome." He set his glasses down on the documents. "Your client's filing presents a claim of prior appropriation for a water source that was already in continuous documented use before he arrived. That is not what prior appropriation means. and I believe you know that. Croft opened his mouth. I'll review the full submission and issue a formal ruling within 5 days, Langley said. That is the process, and we'll follow it. But I will tell you, Counselor, that what I'm looking at right now is not a close case. Croft closed his mouth. The younger man near the door had gone very still. Outside the window, the noise of Laramie continued. Horses, wagon wheels, someone calling across the street. The ordinary sounds of a town that didn't know or care about what was happening in this room. Evelyn sat in her chair and felt something in her chest that she didn't immediately know how to categorize. Not relief. It wasn't over yet, and she was too practical to treat a promising sign as a finished outcome. Not joy. Something quieter than both of those. Something that sat in the space between having fought hard and knowing you'd fought well, regardless of how it ended. She looked at Cole. He was watching Langley, not her, his face carrying its usual composed attention. But his hands, which had been resting on his knees throughout, were no longer quite as still. He had done this. The knowledge in his head that he'd walked away from once before because the system had chewed it up and used it wrong. He'd brought it back into the same kind of room and used it the right way, and whatever it had cost him internally to do that was not something she could see from the outside. But she knew it had cost something. Langley stood. The meeting was over. Croft gathered himself with the controlled dignity of a man who had not won but was not prepared to behave as though he'd lost, and left with his assistant behind him. The door closed. Langley looked at the documents on his desk, then at Evelyn. You'll want to be available for the next 5 days in case I need clarification. We can stay in town, she said. He nodded. He looked at Cole once more with the specific look of a man finishing a thought he'd had earlier. That Farah report was right, he said, for whatever that's worth to you. Cole met his gaze. It's worth something, he said. They walked out into the Laramie street and the cold hit them both, fresh and sharp after the closeness of the office. Evelyn stopped on the boardwalk and stood for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, letting the air move through her lungs. Cole stood beside her. 5 days, she said. 5 days. She looked down the street. Somewhere in this town, Croft was already sending a wire to Blackwell. Blackwell would read it, and his jaw would tighten, and he would start calculating his next move, because men like Gideon Blackwell did not stop calculating just because one calculation had gone wrong. That was a problem for the next 5 days. But right now, on this boardwalk, in this cold, with the documents filed and the argument made and Horace Langley sitting in his office with August Prewitt's meticulous field notes under his careful hands, right now, she let herself feel what she actually felt. She had walked into that room carrying 40 years of history, and she had made it matter. Nobody had done that for her. She'd gone out and gathered it herself, mile by cold mile, door by unfamiliar door, through weather that hadn't cared about her deadline and a territory that hadn't arranged itself for her convenience. She turned to Cole and said, "Thank you." He looked at her. "For what specifically?" "For coming back to something you'd walked away from." He was quiet for a moment, then it was easier to come back to it this time. She didn't ask why. She thought she already knew. They went to find coffee that was hot and food that wasn't dried beef, and let themselves have the next hour as something other than a battle, because the battle had been fought and the rest was waiting. And even people who were good at fighting needed to remember occasionally that fighting wasn't all there was. The 5 days felt long, and then, on the morning of the 4th day, the ruling came. The ruling came on a Tuesday morning, which Evelyn would remember for the rest of her life, not because Tuesdays held any particular significance, but because it was the same day of the week that Cole had arrived at the ranch, and she would think later that there was something fitting about that symmetry. The thing that had started on a Tuesday finding its answer on one. The clerk brought it to their boarding house rather than requiring them to come to the office, which Evelyn understood was not standard practice and meant something, though she wasn't sure exactly what until she unfolded the document and read the first paragraph. The Territorial Land Office of Wyoming, under the authority of Commissioner Horace Langley, hereby finds in favor of Evelyn Catherine Mercer in the matter of water rights pertaining to Harlan Creek and its tributaries as they pertain to the Mercer Ranch property. The prior appropriation claim filed by Gideon Blackwell on November 3rd is hereby denied in full, on the basis that established prior use predating the 1873 Territorial Water Code was insufficiently contested by the claimant, and that the documentation presented by the contesting party demonstrates continuous, uninterrupted, and historically confirmed use of said water source by the Mercer Ranch dating to 1868. Water rights to Harlan Creek, including all natural tributaries and spring-fed sources contributing to its flow, are hereby confirmed as belonging permanently to the Mercer Ranch property, registered and recorded in perpetuity. There was more. 2 more paragraphs about the legal particulars, the registration process, the formal recording of the ruling. Evelyn read all of it twice, then a third time, not because she didn't understand it, but because she needed to be certain she wasn't reading something that said what she wanted it to say, rather than what it actually said. It said what she wanted it to say. Cole was reading over her shoulder. He straightened up when she lowered the document and she turned to look at him. And his face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. Not quite a smile, but the controlled aftermath of one. The look of someone who had felt something strongly and was allowing exactly enough of it to show to be honest about it without being excessive. "Well," she said. "Yeah," he said. She sat down on the edge of the boarding house bed because her legs had decided they'd done enough for the moment, and she held the document in both hands and looked at the window. And outside the window was an ordinary Laramie morning. Gray sky, a dog crossing the street, 2 men loading a wagon in front of the hardware store, and none of it knew or cared that the piece of paper in her hands had just changed the terms of her entire life. She had expected, she realized, to feel more purely happy than this. What she actually felt was more complicated. Relief and exhaustion, and something that ached in a way she couldn't fully explain, because the document in her hands also meant it was over. The fight was over. And the fight, for all that it had been brutal and frightening and had cost her more than she could easily calculate, had also been the most fully alive she had felt since Thomas died. She didn't say that. It was too complicated to say without sounding like she was being ungrateful for the outcome, which she wasn't. She was profoundly grateful. She just understood now that you could be grateful for a thing ending and still mourn, quietly, the particular intensity of the thing while it was happening. Cole was watching her with the careful attention he brought to situations where he was trying to decide whether a person needed something said or whether they needed quiet. He picked quiet, correctly. After a while, she stood up. "We need to get home," she said. They left Laramie that afternoon. Riding back through the pass, the sky had cleared for the first time in a week, and the light on the snow was the particular sharp gold of late autumn at elevation, and Evelyn rode mostly in silence, turning things over. The document was in her satchel against her side. Somewhere ahead of them, Blackwell was receiving word from Croft. She found she had very little feeling about what that moment looked like. Whatever Blackwell felt about losing, anger, recalculation, the specific humiliation of having a plan fail not through bad luck, but through the competence of the person you'd underestimated, that was his to manage. She didn't need to witness it. She needed to get home and see her cattle and check the creek and sit in her kitchen and figure out what came next. They were most of the way through the pass, the valley visible in the distance below them, when Cole said, "Langley sent a separate notice to the county sheriff, ordering the removal of the diversion dam." Evelyn looked at him. "When?" "It was in the registration packet. I read it while you were settling up with the boarding house." He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "Adler has to execute it within 10 days or answer to the territorial office." "Adler won't like that." "No, but he'll do it. Langley outranks his relationship with Blackwell by enough that he won't risk the exposure." Cole paused. "The dam comes down. The creek comes back." She let that settle. The creek comes back. All that water moving down through the high country from 3 separate springs, finding its way back into the channel that had carried it for decades, running down through the cottonwood and the limestone banks, and filling the stock tank in the east pasture. The cattle drinking without rationing. The hay meadow getting what it needed through winter. It was such a simple thing. Water running where it was supposed to run. And it had taken everything she had to ensure it. They came down out of the pass in the late afternoon and rode the last miles to the ranch as the sun was going low and red behind the western ridges. Pete must have heard the horses on the road because he was standing in the yard when they rode in, and Danny was beside him with his hat in his hands doing something anxious with the brim. Evelyn dismounted and looked at Pete's face, and he read hers, and something in his old shoulders let go. "Well?" he said. She pulled the ruling from her satchel and held it out. He took it with both hands and read it with the slowness of a man who wants to be certain, And when he finished, his jaw was working in the way of someone who has a great deal of feeling and not much practice expressing it. "Permanent," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Permanent," she confirmed. Pete handed the document back to her. He nodded once, precisely, and then he turned away and walked toward the barn, and Danny started to say something, and Pete put a hand on the boy's shoulder briefly as he passed, which was more than Pete usually said about anything. Danny looked at Evelyn. "We won." "We won," she said. Danny let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a yell, and went off to tell his horse about it, which was more or less the most Danny thing he could have done. Cole led both horses toward the barn. Evelyn stood in the yard for a moment in the last of the red light, holding the document, looking at her land. The east pasture, the dark line of the creek, the outbuildings, the house with its uneven porch and its drafty siding that still needed work. The sky going purple over the northern ridge where all this had begun, where a dam had been built in the dark by men who believed a young widow with a depleted crew was a problem that would solve itself. She went inside and made coffee. What followed was not a celebration exactly. It was quieter than that. Pete came in from the barn and sat at the table. Danny drifted in after a while. Cole came in last, having seen to both horses, and sat across from Evelyn with the ease of someone who belonged in the room. Not because the room had declared itself to him, but because he'd earned his place in it through ordinary, unglamorous, daily work that didn't ask for acknowledgement. They ate a meal together and talked about practical things. The dam removal would take a week, maybe 2 after Adler got moving on it, which he wouldn't do immediately. The creek would come back slowly, not all at once. The stock tank would need 2 weeks of normal flow before it was back to capacity. The hay meadow had lost some ground to the dry weeks, and they'd need to assess whether they had enough winter feed or whether they needed to buy supplemental. These were the real problems, the ones that didn't resolve dramatically. The ruling was won, but the ranch still had to survive the winter it had been pointed toward, and that was going to take the same combination of work and calculation and occasional luck that it always had. The legal victory changed the terms. It didn't change the nature of the work itself. Evelyn knew this and was not disappointed by it. This was what she'd fought for, the right to do the work, not to be finished with it. 2 days later, with things at the ranch settling into their new stability, Cole packed his gear. Evelyn saw him doing it from the doorway of the barn. She stood there for a moment, not going in, watching him roll his blanket with the practiced economy of someone who had been packing and unpacking a bedroll for long enough that it was pure muscle memory. The gray mare was already brushed and stood quietly in her stall, better rested than she'd been in weeks. Evelyn had known it might come to this. She'd known it since that first day when he'd said, "most recent," instead of recently, and she'd understood that the chain of places behind him was long, and that people with long chains sometimes didn't stop for reasons that had nothing to do with the place where they were standing. She walked into the barn. "Where?" she said. Cole looked up. He didn't pretend not to know what she was asking. Hadn't decided. "You were going to leave without deciding." "I was going to ride until something made sense." She looked at him. He was not a man who said more than he meant, and she had learned to hear what was behind what he said. Until something made sense was not the same as until I find a place to go. It was the language of someone who was accustomed to motion being the answer to a feeling they couldn't name while standing still. "The work here isn't finished," she said. "The legal fight is. That was never the only work." She crossed her arms. "Pete's back is getting worse. Danny's good, but he's not experienced enough to manage the spring branding without proper supervision. The north fence needs rebuilding before winter really sets in. The hay meadow situation needs someone who—" "Evelyn," she stopped. He was looking at her with the steady, direct quality she had come to understand was not detachment, but its opposite. Someone paying close enough attention that they could see past what you were saying to the thing underneath it. "That's not why you came in here," he said. She held his gaze. "No," she said. "It's not." The barn was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass, and a horse stamped somewhere in its stall. The sounds of the place, her place. She said, "I spent 8 months watching people leave. Hired hands, neighbors stepping back, everyone calculating how long before this ranch failed, and they didn't have to keep pretending they thought it wouldn't." She kept her voice even, because she needed to say this clearly, and crying would make it less clear, and she was committed to being clear. I stopped asking people to stay because I got tired of watching them decide to go anyway. She looked at him. I'm asking you to stay. Cole set down what he was holding. A long moment passed, the kind of moment that has weight to it. I'm not easy to live alongside, he said. I've got a past I don't talk about that's going to come up eventually whether I want it to or not. I have mornings where I'm not good company, and I'm not always going to be able to explain why. He paused. And I don't know how to be part of something the way other men seem to know how. I'm better at arriving than at staying. I know all of that, Evelyn said. And? And I'm asking anyway. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she felt the full exposure of the ask, the way it sat there between them, visible and impossible to take back, and not something she'd have taken back even if she could. Then he said, You're not asking me to stay as a hired hand. No, she said. I'm not. The silence between them after that was different from the silences before it. She'd had months to learn the difference between Cole's silences. There were the thinking ones and the uncomfortable ones, and the ones that meant he was working something out, and the ones that meant he'd already worked it out and was just finishing arriving at the answer. This was the last kind. All right, he said. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. All right, she said back. He almost smiled again. Almost. It was enough. They were married before the first real snowfall, which came in the third week of November. The ceremony was small because small was what they both wanted. Pete and Danny as witnesses, a territorial judge named Foster, who rode out from town and had the good sense not to make the occasion more elaborate than the two people involved wanted it to be. The ceremony happened on the porch, which was drafty and slightly uneven and was where everything of significance had happened at the Mercer Ranch. And Evelyn figured there was no reason to change that now. Danny cried, which he would deny for the rest of his association with the ranch, but which Pete would occasionally mention in company when Danny got too full of himself. Pete shook Cole's hand afterward with both of his, which was the most demonstrative thing Evelyn had ever seen Pete do, and then said something quietly that she couldn't hear, and Cole looked at the old man with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Something open and unexpectedly young. She didn't ask what was said. Some things between men didn't need to be reported. The legal recording of the marriage had a practical dimension that was not romantic but was real. Under territorial law, the water rights recorded in Evelyn's name now attached to jointly held property. What had been vulnerable to one woman's solitary legal standing was now secured by the combined standing of a registered ranch with two named owners. It was the kind of protection that no diversion dam and no delayed legal proceeding could easily undo. And Cole had understood this when he'd agreed to be part of it, and Evelyn had understood it too. And neither of them thought it reduced what they felt about the other to acknowledge that practical things could also be true at the same time. That was, she thought, the thing that the year had taught her most forcefully. That nothing was only one thing. Grief was also determination. Fear was also clarity. A fight over water rights was also a fight for the right to keep becoming the person you were still in the process of becoming. And a man who arrived with a worn jacket and a refusal to discuss his past could also be the most honest person in your life, if you paid attention. The dam came down on a Saturday, 12 days after the ruling, executed under protest by Sheriff Adler with the enthusiasm of a man performing a task at gunpoint. Evelyn didn't ride up to watch it, which surprised Cole. You don't want to see it? He said. I'll see it when the creek comes back, she said. That's the part I care about. The creek came back over the course of a week. Not dramatically. There was no moment where it suddenly surged back to full strength. It came back the way all real things do, incrementally and unevenly, a little stronger each morning when she walked the east pasture, the exposed limestone slowly disappearing underwater, the stock tank level rising by degrees she could measure with a stick she kept at the bank for that purpose. On the 8th morning, she went to the tank and the mark she'd made the day before was underwater. She stood there for a moment with the cold working through her coat and the cattle moving in the pasture behind her, unhurried and unbothered as cattle always are when they have what they need, and she felt something complete and quiet move through her that she didn't try to name. She heard Cole's boots on the frozen ground behind her. It's back, she said. He came and stood beside her and looked at the water level. Most of it. The rest'll come. Prewitt said the upper springs take 2 weeks to fully recover after a diversion. He'd know. They stood there together for a while, not saying much, watching the water. The sky above the north ridge was clear for the first time in weeks, and the light was coming down straight and cold on the pasture grass, and the cattle moved through it like they owned the ground, which they essentially did, which was the whole point of everything that had happened. Gideon Blackwell's letter arrived in December, 6 weeks after the ruling. It was brief, 3 sentences on expensive paper, delivered by ordinary post rather than by legal courier, which told her something about its intent. He wrote that he acknowledged the ruling of the Territorial Land Office and would not pursue further challenge. He wrote that he had instructed his foreman to ensure that no activity on Blackwell properties would interfere with the natural flow of Harlan Creek going forward. And he wrote that he hoped the coming seasons would be productive for the Mercer Ranch, which was the kind of thing you wrote when you needed to close a subject and didn't know how to do it gracefully. It was not an apology. She hadn't expected one. She showed it to Cole, who read it and handed it back without comment. "Good enough?" she asked. "Good enough," he said. She put it in the trunk with Thomas's grandfather's survey map and Margaret Hargrove's careful cursive and Joseph Walks Farr's signed statement and August Pruitt's rolled field notes. She put it there not as a trophy, but as a record, because records were how you kept things from having to be fought for twice. The winter was hard in the way Wyoming winters are always hard. Not cruel exactly, but indifferent, which is sometimes worse. There were weeks of cold that tested the fencing and the shelter and the supply of feed they'd been able to put up. The hay meadow, fully watered through November, had recovered better than Evelyn had feared, but not as well as she'd hoped, and they supplemented with purchased feed through January, which was an expense she'd not planned for but managed. Pete's back gave him serious trouble in February, and he spent 3 weeks largely indoors, which cost him more than it would have cost most men, because Pete's sense of himself was built entirely around his usefulness, and being useful required being able to move. Evelyn dealt with this by finding things he could do sitting down: harness repair, equipment inventory, teaching Danny the ranch's bookkeeping system that nobody had properly organized since Thomas died. It was not a solution so much as a workaround, and Pete knew it and was ungracious about it for about a week before he settled. Danny turned 20 in February and was becoming, quietly and without fanfare, a capable hand. He still panicked sometimes under acute pressure. That was probably temperament more than inexperience. But he developed the ability to look at a problem and work backward from it, which was the most important skill in ranch work and the hardest to teach. Cole was not an easy person to live with, as he had warned her, and was right about that in ways that were sometimes surprising. He had bad mornings that appeared without pattern or warning, where he was present in the physical sense but had retreated somewhere she couldn't reach. And the most useful thing she could do on those mornings was leave him alone and let him find his way back to himself, which he always did, usually by mid-afternoon. He had opinions about how things should be done that were occasionally different from her opinions about how things should be done, and they had arguments about this. Real arguments, not the careful negotiated disagreements of two people trying to avoid conflict, but the genuine friction of two people with strong views trying to operate the same piece of ground. The arguments resolved, mostly. Sometimes she was right. Sometimes he was. A few times they found a third option that neither of them had started with. She had not expected marriage to be simple. She had been married before, to a man she'd loved straightforwardly and lost suddenly. And she understood now that even the simplest love is complicated by the daily fact of two people trying to share a life. With Cole, it was less simple than it had been with Thomas, and more solid in ways she was still learning to describe. Thomas had known her before she knew herself. Cole had met her in the middle of becoming someone, and that was a different thing entirely. In April, when the snow was finally off the lower pastures and the creek was running with the energy of spring snowmelt from the high country, full and quick and cold, the limestone banks fully submerged, the stock tank overflowing into the channel Thomas's grandfather had dug, Evelyn and Cole rode the full length of the property together. It was something she'd started doing each spring when Thomas was alive, a survey of the land to assess what winter had taken and what it had left. And she'd let it lapse after he died because the ritual had felt too attached to him to survive without him. She revived it now. With someone else beside her, which was different and which was allowed to be different, they rode from the southern boundary to the northern ridge, through the east pasture and the hay meadow and the high ground where the fencing had needed work and had gotten it over the winter. The cattle were out in numbers now, moving across the new grass with the particular contentment of animals that have been through cold and scarcity and come out the other side into abundance. The creek ran alongside them for most of the eastern stretch, clear and strong, and Evelyn rode close to the bank for a while just to hear it. At the northern ridge they stopped, as she had always stopped with Thomas, and looked south over the whole of it, the ranch. 5,000 acres of Wyoming that she had nearly lost, and had not lost, and that looked from up here in the spring light the way it always looked from up here, open and difficult and worth it. Cole was beside her. He hadn't spoken much on the ride, which was normal for him, and she hadn't either, which was normal for her. "It's a lot of land," he said finally. "It is. Gonna need work all summer." "It always does." He was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking the south pasture fence might benefit from being moved about 30 yards east. Better access to the creek for the summer grazing rotation." She looked at him. "I was thinking the same thing." "You didn't say." "I was waiting to see what you'd come up with." He turned and looked at her with an expression she had learned to read as the particular look of a man who knows he's been managed and finds it more amusing than annoying. "That's a habit I'd like you to break." "I'll think about it," she said. They rode back down from the ridge in the spring light. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and there would always be work to do, and that was the nature of the thing they'd chosen and the thing they'd fought for. It was not a romantic notion. It was the actual fact of what a ranch was, an endless series of problems that rewarded people who were willing to stay and figure them out rather than leaving when the figuring got hard. She had stayed. He had stayed. And the water was running where it was supposed to run, down from the high country through springs that had been flowing before either of them was born, finding the channel that had been waiting for it all winter, moving south through limestone and cottonwood toward the pastures and the tanks and the cattle and the people who had fought to keep it. The water didn't know any of that. It just moved, the way water always moves, following the lowest path, finding its way through whatever lay between where it started and where it needed to go. She thought there was something in that. Maybe not wisdom exactly, but something worth looking at. Something about the value of keeping to your course even when someone has tried to redirect you. Something about what it meant to flow back into your own channel after someone had done their level best to take it from you. She didn't say any of that out loud because it would have sounded like a conclusion, and her life was not a concluded thing. It was ongoing, messy, uncertain in the particular way that all living things are uncertain. But riding back toward the ranch house in the April light, with the creek running strong beside her and Cole riding a half length to her left, and the mountain still white at the top above a valley that was greening up after the long cold, she let herself feel, plainly and without decoration, that she was glad to be here, that she had earned the right to be here, that the land and the water and the hard work of the seasons ahead were hers. Not because anyone had given them to her, because she had gone out into the cold and the dark and the uncertainty and she had fought for them, clearly and without apology, and she had not stopped when it was hard, and she had let the right person stand beside her when standing alone was no longer the point. The ranch house came into view below them, smoke from the kitchen chimney, Pete's bent figure moving between the barn and the tool shed, Danny crossing the yard with a bucket, young and purposeful in the way of people who are becoming something. Home. She rode toward it,